Chapter 1. The Scientific Literature on the Problems of the Dream. In the following pages, I shall prove that there exists a psychological technique by which dreams may be interpreted, and that upon the application of this method, every dream will show itself to be a senseful, psychological structure which may be introduced into an assignable place in the psychic activity of the waking state. I shall furthermore endeavour to explain the processes which give rise to the strangeness and obscurity of the dream, and to discover through them the nature of the psychic forces which operate, whether in combination or in opposition, to produce the dream. This accomplished, my investigation will terminate, as it will have reached the point where the problem of the dream meets the broader problems, the solution of which must be attempted through other material. I must presuppose that the reader is acquainted with the work done by earlier authors, as well as with the present status of the dream problem in science, since in the course of this treatise I shall not often have occasion to return to them. For, notwithstanding the effort of several thousand years, little progress has been made in the scientific understanding of dreams. This has been so universally acknowledged by the authors that it seems unnecessary to quote individual opinions. One will find in the writings indexed at the end of this book many stimulating observations and plenty of interesting material for our subject, but little or nothing that concerns the true nature of the dream or that solves definitively any of its enigmas. Still less, of course, has been transmitted to the knowledge of the educated laity. The first book in which the dream is treated as an object of psychology seems to be that of Aristotle, concerning dreams and their interpretation. Aristotle asserts that the dream is of demoniacal, though not of divine nature, which indeed contains deep meaning if it be correctly interpreted. He was also acquainted with some of the characteristics of dream life, e.g., he knew that the dream turns slight sensations perceived during sleep into great ones. One imagines that one walks through fire and feels hot, if this or that part of the body becomes slightly warmed, which led him to conclude that dreams might easily betray to the physician the first indications of an incipient change in the body passing unnoticed during the day. I've been unable to go more deeply into the Aristotelian treatise because of insufficient preparation and lack of skilled assistance. As everyone knows, the ancients before Aristotle did not consider the dream a product of the dreaming mind, but a divine inspiration, and in ancient times the two antagonistic streams, which one finds throughout in the estimates of dream life, were already noticeable. They distinguished between true and valuable dreams, sent to the dreamer to warn him or to foretell the future, and vain, fraudulent, and empty dreams, the object of which was to misguide or lead him to destruction. This pre-scientific conception of the dream among the ancients was certainly in perfect keeping with their general view of life, which was wont to project as reality in the outer world that which possessed reality only within the mind. It, moreover, accounted for the main impression made upon the waking life by the memory left from the dream in the morning, for in this memory the dream, as compared with the rest of the psychic content, seems something strange, coming, as it were, from another world. It would likewise be wrong to suppose that the theory of the supernatural origin of dreams lacks followers in our own day, for leaving out of consideration all bigoted and mystical authors, who are perfectly justified in adhering to the remnants of the once extensive realm of the supernatural until they have been swept away by scientific explanation, one meets even sagacious men averse to anything adventurous, who go so far as to base their religious belief in the existence and cooperation of superhuman forces on the inexplicableness of the dream manifestations. Hafner. The validity ascribed to the dream life by some schools of philosophy, e.g. the school of Schelling, is a distinct echo of the undisputed divinity of dreams in antiquity, nor is discussion closed on the subject of the mantic or prophetic power of dreams. This is due to the fact that the attempted psychological explanations are too inadequate to overcome the accumulated material, however strongly all those who devote themselves to a scientific mode of thought may feel that such assertions should be repudiated. To write a history of our scientific knowledge of dream problems is so difficult because, however valuable some parts of this knowledge may have been, no progress in definite directions has been discernible. There has been no construction of a foundation of assured results upon which future investigators could continue to build. But every new author takes up the same problems afresh and from the very beginning. Were I to follow the authors in chronological order, and give a review of the opinions each has held concerning the problems of the dream, I should be prevented from drawing a clear and complete picture of the present state of knowledge on the subject. I have therefore preferred to base the treatment upon themes rather than upon the authors, and I shall cite for each problem of the dream the material found in the literature for its solution. But as I have not succeeded in mastering the entire literature, which is widely disseminated and interwoven with that on other subjects, I must ask my readers to rest content, provided no fundamental fact or important viewpoint be lost in my description. Until recently, most authors have been led to treat the subjects of sleep and dream in the same connection, and with them they have also regularly treated analogous states of psychopathology, and other dreamlike states like hallucinations, visions, etc. In the more recent works, on the other hand, there has been a tendency to keep more closely to the theme, and to take as the subject one single question of the dream life. This change, I believe, is an expression of the conviction that enlightenment and agreement in such obscure matters can only be brought about by a series of detailed investigations. It is such a detailed investigation, and one of a special psychological nature, that I would offer here. I have little occasion to study the problem of sleep, as it is essentially a psychological problem, although the change of functional determinations for the mental apparatus must be included in the character of sleep. The literature of sleep will therefore not be considered here. A scientific interest in the phenomena of dreams as such leads to the following in part interdependent inquiries. A. The relation of the dream to the waking state. The naive judgment of a person on awakening assumes that the dream, if indeed it does not originate in another world, at any rate has taken the dreamer into another world. The old physiologist, Burdach, to whom we are indebted for a careful and discriminating description of the phenomena of dreams, expressed this conviction in an often-quoted passage, page 474. The waking life never repeats itself, with its trials and joys, its pleasures and pains, but, on the contrary, the dream aims to relieve us of these. Even when our whole mind is filled with one subject, when profound sorrow has torn our hearts, or when a task has claimed the whole power of our mentality, the dream either gives us something entirely strange, or it takes for its combinations only a few elements from reality, or it only enters into the strain of our mood and symbolizes reality. L. Strumpel expresses himself to the same effect in his Nature and Origin of Dreams, page 16, a study which is everywhere justly held in high respect. He who dreams turns his back upon the world of waking consciousness, page 17. In the dream, the memory of the orderly content of the waking consciousness and its normal behavior is as good as entirely lost, page 19. The almost complete isolation of the mind in the dream from the regular normal content and course of the waking state. But the overwhelming majority of the authors have assumed a contrary view of the relation of the dream to waking life. Thus Hafner, page 19. First of all, the dream is the continuation of the waking state. Our dreams always unite themselves with those ideas which have shortly before been in our consciousness. Careful examination will nearly always find a thread by which the dream has connected itself with the experience of the previous day. Weigand, page 6, flatly contradicts the above-cited statement of Burdach. For it may often be observed, apparently in the great majority of dreams, that they lead us directly back into everyday life, instead of releasing us from it. Maury, page 56, says in a concise formula, Nous rêvons de ce que nous avons vu, dit, désiré ou fait. Jessen, in his Psychology, published in 1855, page 530, is somewhat more explicit. The content of dreams is more or less determined by the individual personality, by age, sex, station in life, education, habits, and by events and experiences of the whole past life. The ancients had the same idea about the dependence of the dream content upon life. I cite Radistock, page 139. When Xerxes, before his march against Greece, was dissuaded from this resolution by good counsel, but was again and again incited by dreams to undertake it, one of the old rational dream interpreters of the Persians, Artabanus, told him very appropriately that dream pictures mostly contain that of which one has been thinking while awake. In the didactic poem of Lucretius, De Rerum Natura, 4.5.959, occurs this passage. et quo quisque fere studio devinctus adheret, aut quibus in rebus multum sumus antemorati, atque in ea ratione fuit contenta megis mens, in somnis iedam plerumque videmur obire, casidici causas agere et componere leges, induperatores pugnare ac proilia obire, etc., etc. Cicero, De Divinatione, too, says quite similarly, as does also Mori much later, maximeque reliquiae erum rerum moventur in animis et agitantur, de quibis vigilantes aut cogitavimus aut egimus. The contradiction expressed in these two views as to the relation between dream life and waking life seems indeed insoluble. It will therefore not be out of place to mention the description of F. W. Hildebrand, 1875, who believes that the peculiarities of the dream can generally be described only by calling them a series of contrasts which apparently shade off into contradictions. Page 8. The first of these contrasts is formed on the one hand by the strict isolation or seclusion of the dream from true and actual life, and on the other hand by the continuous encroachment of the one upon the other, and the constant dependency of one upon the other. The dream is something absolutely separated from the reality experienced during the waking state. One may call it an existence hermetically sealed up and separated from real life by an unsurmountable chasm. It frees us from reality, extinguishes normal recollection of reality, and places us in another world and in a totally different life, which at bottom has nothing in common with reality. Hildebrand then asserts that in falling asleep our whole being, with all its forms of existence, disappears, as through an invisible trap-door. In the dream one is perhaps making a voyage to St. Helena, in order to offer the imprisoned Napoleon something exquisite in the way of Moselle wine. One is most amicably received by the ex-emperor, and feels almost sorry when the interesting illusion is destroyed on awakening. But let us now compare the situation of the dream with reality. The dreamer has never been a wine merchant, and has no desire to become one. He has never made a sea voyage, and St. Helena is the last place he would take as destination for such a voyage. The dreamer entertains no sympathetic feeling for Napoleon, but on the contrary, a strong patriotic hatred. And finally, the dreamer was not yet among the living when Napoleon died on the island, so that it was beyond the reach of possibility for him to have had any personal relations with Napoleon. The dream experience thus appears as something strange, inserted between two perfectly harmonizing and succeeding periods. Nevertheless, continues Hildebrand, the opposite is seemingly just as true and correct. I believe that hand in hand with this seclusion and isolation there can still exist the most intimate relation and connection. We may justly say that no matter what the dream offers, it finds its material in reality and in the psychic life arrayed around this reality. However strange the dream may seem, it can never detach itself from reality, and its most sublime, as well as its most farcical structures, must always borrow their elementary material either from what we have seen with our eyes in the outer world, or from what has previously found a place somewhere in our waking thoughts. In other words, it must be taken from what we had already experienced either objectively or subjectively. B. The material of the dream. Memory in the dream. That all the material composing the content of the dream in some way originates in experience, that it is reproduced in the dream or recalled, this at least may be taken as an indisputable truth. Yet it would be wrong to assume that such connection between dream content and reality will be readily disclosed as an obvious product of the instituted comparison. On the contrary, the connection must be carefully sought, and in many cases it succeeds in eluding discovery for a long time. The reason for this is to be found in a number of peculiarities evinced by the memory in dreams, which, though universally known, have hitherto entirely eluded explanation. It will be worthwhile to investigate exhaustively these characteristics. It often happens that matter appears in the dream content which one cannot recognize later in the waking state as belonging to one's knowledge and experience. One remembers well enough having dreamed about the subject in question, but cannot recall the fact or time of the experience. The dreamer is therefore in the dark as to the source from which the dream has been drawing, and is even tempted to believe an independently productive activity on the part of the dream, until, often long afterwards, a new episode brings back to recollection a former experience given up as lost, and thus reveals the source of the dream. One is thus forced to admit that something has been known and remembered in the dream that has been withdrawn from memory during the waking state. Delboeuf narrates from his own experience an especially impressive example of this kind. He saw in his dream the courtyard of his house covered with snow, and found 2 little lizards half frozen and buried in the snow. Being a lover of animals, he picked them up, warmed them, and put them back into a crevice in the wall which was reserved for them. He also gave them some small fern leaves that had been growing on the wall, which he knew they were fond of. In the dream he knew the name of the plant, Asplenium ruta moralis. The dream then continued, returning after a digression to the lizards, and to his astonishment Delboeuf saw 2 other little animals falling upon what was left of the ferns. On turning his eyes to the open field, he saw a 5th and a 6th lizard running into the hole in the wall, and finally the street was covered with a procession of lizards, all wandering in the same direction, etc. In his waking state, Delboeuf knew only a few Latin names of plants, and nothing of the Asplenium. To his great surprise, he became convinced that a fern of this name really existed, and that the correct name was Asplenium ruta moraria, which the dream had slightly disfigured. An accidental coincidence could hardly be considered, but it remained a mystery for Delboeuf whence he got his knowledge of the name Asplenium in the dream. The dream occurred in 1862. 16 years later, while at the house of one of his friends, the philosopher noticed a small album containing dried plants resembling the albums that are sold as souvenirs to visitors in many parts of Switzerland. A sudden recollection occurred to him. He opened the herbarium and discovered therein the Asplenium of his dream, and recognized his own handwriting in the accompanying Latin name. The connection could now be traced. While on her wedding trip, a sister of this friend visited Delboeuf in 1860, 2 years prior to the lizard dream. She had with her at the time this album, which was intended for her brother, and Delboeuf took the trouble to write, at the dictation of a botanist, under each of the dried plants, the Latin name. The favourable accident, which made possible the report of this valuable example, also permitted Delboeuf to trace another portion of this dream to its forgotten source. One day in 1877 he came upon an old volume of an illustrated journal, in which he found pictured the whole procession of lizards just as he had dreamed it in 1862. The volume bore the date of 1861, and Delboeuf could recall that he had subscribed to the journal from its first appearance. That the dream has at its disposal recollections which are inaccessible to the waking state is such a remarkable and theoretically important fact that I should like to urge more attention to it by reporting several other hypamnesic dreams. Maury relates that for some time the word Musidan used to occur to his mind during the day. He knew it to be the name of a French city, but nothing else. One night he dreamed of a conversation with a certain person who told him that she came from Musidan, and in answer to his question where the city was, she replied, "Musidan is a principal country town in the département de la Dordogne." On waking, Maury put no faith in the information received in his dream. The geographical lexicon, however, showed it to be perfectly correct. In this case, the superior knowledge of the dream is confirmed, but the forgotten source of this knowledge has not been traced. Jessen tells, page 55, of a quite similar dream occurrence from more remote times. Among others, we may here mention the dream of the elder Scaliger, Hennings, L.C., page 300, who wrote a poem in praise of celebrated men of Verona, and to whom a man named Brugnolus appeared in a dream, complaining that he had been neglected. Though Scaliger did not recall ever having heard of him, he wrote some verses in his honour, and his son later discovered at Verona that a Brugnolus had formerly been famous there as a critic. Myers is said to have published a whole collection of such hypamnesic dreams in the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research, which are unfortunately inaccessible to me. I believe everyone who occupies himself with dreams will recognize as a very common phenomenon the fact that the dream gives proof of knowing and recollecting matters unknown to the waking person. In my psychoanalytic investigations of nervous patients, of which I shall speak later, I am every week more than once in position to convince my patients from their dreams that they are well acquainted with quotations, obscene expressions, etc., and that they make use of these in their dreams, although they have forgotten them in the waking state. I shall cite here a simple case of dream hypomnesia because it was easy to trace the source which made the knowledge accessible to the dream. A patient dreamed in a lengthy connection that he ordered a kontusovka in a cafe, and after reporting this inquired what it might mean, as he never heard the name before. I was able to answer that kontusovka was a Polish liquor which he could not have invented in his dream, as the name had long been familiar to me in advertisements. The patient would not at first believe me, but some days later, after he had realized his dream of the cafe, he noticed the name on a signboard at the street corner, which he had been obliged to pass for months, at least twice a day. I have learned from my own dreams how largely the discovery of the origin of some of the dream elements depends on accident. Thus, for years before writing this book, I was haunted by the picture of a very simply formed church tower, which I could not recall having seen. I then suddenly recognized it with absolute certainty at a small station between Salzburg and Reichenhall. This was in the later 90s, and I had travelled over the road for the first time in the year 1886. In later years, when I was already busily engaged in the study of dreams, I was quite annoyed at the frequent recurrence of the dream picture of a certain peculiar locality. I saw it in definite local relation to my person. To my left, a dark space from which many grotesque sandstone figures stood out. A glimmer of recollection, which I did not quite credit, told me it was the entrance to a beer cellar, but I could explain neither the meaning nor the origin of this dream picture. In 1907, I came by chance to Padua, which, to my regret, I had been unable to visit since 1895. My first visit to this beautiful university city was unsatisfactory. I was unable to see Giotto's frescoes in the church of the Madonna dell'Arena, and on my way there turned back on being informed that the little church was closed on the day. On my second visit, 12 years later, I thought of compensating myself for this, and before everything else I started out for Madonna dell'Arena. On the street leading to it, on my left, probably at the place where I had turned in 1895, I discovered the locality which I had so often seen in the dream, with its sandstone figures. It was in fact the entrance to a restaurant garden. One of the sources from which the dream draws material for reproduction, material which in part is not recalled or employed in waking thought, is to be found in childhood. I shall merely cite some of the authors who have observed and emphasized this. Hildebrandt, page 23. It has already been expressly admitted that the dream sometimes brings back to the mind with wonderful reproductive ability remote and even forgotten experiences from the earliest periods. Strumpel, page 40. The subject becomes more interesting when we remember how the dream sometimes brings forth, as it were, from among the deepest and heaviest strata which later years have piled upon the earliest childhood experiences, the pictures of certain places, things, and persons, quite uninjured and with their original freshness. This is not limited merely to such impressions as have gained vivid consciousness during their origin, or have become impressed with strong psychic validity, and then later return in the dream as actual reminiscences, causing pleasure to the awakened consciousness. On the contrary, the depths of the dream memory comprise also such pictures of persons, things, places, and early experiences as either possessed but little consciousness and no psychic value at all, or have long ago lost both, and therefore appear totally strange and unknown both in the dream and in the waking state, until their former origin is revealed. Volkelt, page 119. It is essentially noteworthy how early infantile and youthful reminiscences enter into the dream. What we have long ceased to think about, what has long since lost for us all importance, is constantly recalled by the dream. The sway of the dream over the infantile material, which, as is well known, mostly occupies the gaps in the conscious memory, causes the origin of interesting hypomnestic dreams, a few of which I shall here report. Maury relates, page 92, that as a child he often went from his native city, Meaux, to the neighbouring Trilport, where his father superintended the construction of a bridge. On a certain night a dream transported him to Trilport, and he was again playing in the city's streets. A man approached him wearing some sort of uniform. Maury asked him his name, and he introduced himself, saying that his name was C. Blank, and that he was a bridge guard. On waking, Maury, who still doubted the reality of the reminiscence, asked his old servant, who had been with him in his childhood, whether she remembered a man of this name. "Certainly," was the answer. "He used to be watchman on the bridge which your father was building at that time." Maury reports another example demonstrating just as nicely the reliability of infantile reminiscences appearing in dreams. Mr. F. Blank, who had lived as a child in Montbrison, decided to visit his home and old friends of his family after an absence of 25 years. The night before his departure, he dreamt that he had reached his destination and that he met, near Montbrison, a man whom he did not know by sight, who told him he was Mr. F., a friend of his father. The dreamer remembered that as a child he had known a gentleman of this name, but on waking he could no longer recall his features. Several days later, having really arrived at Montbrison, he found the supposedly unknown locality of his dream, and there met a man whom he at once recognized as the Mr. F. of his dream. The real person was only older than the one in the dream picture. I may here relate one of my own dreams in which the remembered impression is replaced by an association. In my dream, I saw a person whom I recognized while dreaming as the physician of my native town. The features were indistinct and confused with the picture of one of my colleague teachers, whom I still see occasionally. What association there was between the two persons I could not discover on awakening, but upon questioning my mother about the physician of my early childhood, I discovered that he was a one-eyed man. My teacher, whose figure concealed that of the physician in the dream, was also one-eyed. I have not seen the physician for 38 years, and I have not, to my knowledge, thought of him in my waking state, although a scar on my chin might have reminded me of his help. As if to counterbalance the immense role ascribed to the infantile impressions in the dream, many authors assert that the majority of dreams show elements from the most recent time. Thus Robert, page 46, declares that the normal dream generally occupies itself only with the impressions of the recent days. We learn indeed that the theory of the dream advanced by Robert imperatively demands that the old impressions should be pushed back, and the recent ones brought to the front. Nevertheless, the fact claimed by Robert really exists. I can confirm this from my own investigations. Nelson, an American author, thinks that the impressions most frequently found in the dream date from 2 or 3 days before, as if the impressions of the day immediately preceding the dream were not sufficiently weakened and remote. Many authors who are convinced of the intimate connection between the dream content and the waking state are impressed by the fact that impressions which have intensely occupied the waking mind appear in the dream only after they have been to some extent pushed aside from the elaboration of the waking thought. Thus, as a rule, we do not dream of a dead, beloved person while we are still overwhelmed with sorrow. Still, Miss Hallam, one of the latest observers, has collected examples showing the very opposite behavior, and claims for the point the right of individual psychology. The third and the most remarkable and incomprehensible peculiarity of the memory in dreams is shown in the selection of the reproduced material, for stress is laid not only on the most significant, but also on the most indifferent and superficial reminiscences. On this point I shall quote those authors who have expressed their surprise in the most emphatic manner. Hildebrand, page 11. For it is a remarkable fact that dreams do not, as a rule, take their elements from great and deep-rooted events, or from the powerful and urgent interests of the preceding day, but from unimportant matters, from the most worthless fragments of recent experience, or of a more remote past. The most shocking death in our family, the impressions of which keep us awake long into the night, becomes obliterated from our memories, until the first moment of awakening brings it back to us with depressing force. On the other hand, the wart on the forehead of a passing stranger, of whom we did not think for a second after he was out of sight, plays its part in our dreams. Schrumpel, page 39. Such cases where the analysis of a dream brings to light elements which, although derived from events of the previous day or the day before the last, yet prove to be so unimportant and worthless for the waking state that they merge into forgetfulness shortly after coming to light. Such occurrences may be statements of others heard accidentally, or actions superficially observed, or fleeting perceptions of things or persons, or single phrases from books, etc. Havelock Ellis, page 727. The profound emotions of waking life, the questions and problems on which we spread our chief voluntary mental energy, are not those which usually present themselves at once to dream consciousness. It is, so far as the immediate past is concerned, mostly the trifling, the incidental, the forgotten impressions of daily life which reappear in our dreams. The psychic activities that are awake most intensely are those that sleep most profoundly. Binz, page 45, takes occasion from the above-mentioned characteristics of the memory in dreams to express his dissatisfaction with explanations of dreams which he himself has approved of. And the normal dream raises similar questions. Why do we not always dream of memory impressions from the preceding days, instead of going back to the almost forgotten past lying far behind us without any perceptible reason? Why in a dream does consciousness so often revive the impression of indifferent memory pictures, while the cerebral cells, bearing the most sensitive records of experience, remain for the most part inert and numb, unless an acute revival during the waking state has shortly before excited them? We can readily understand how the strange preference of the dream memory for the indifferent and hence the unnoticed details of daily experience must usually lead us to overlook altogether the dependence of the dream on the waking state, or at least make it difficult to prove this dependence in any individual case. It thus happened that in the statistical treatment of her own and her friends' dreams, Miss White-and-Calkins found 11% of the entire number that showed no relation to the waking state. Hildebrandt was certainly correct in his assertion that all our dream pictures could be genetically explained if we devoted enough time and material to the tracing of their origin. To be sure, he calls this a most tedious and thankless job, for it would at most lead us to ferret out all kinds of quite worthless psychic material from the most remote corners of the memory chamber, and to bring to light some very indifferent moments from the remote past which were perhaps buried the next hour after their appearance. I must, however, express my regret that this discerning author refrained from following the road whose beginning looked so unpromising. It would have led him directly to the centre of the dream problem. The behaviour of the memory in dreams is surely most significant for every theory of memory in general. It teaches us that nothing which we have once psychically possessed is ever entirely lost, Scholz, or as Delboeuf puts it, que toute impression, même la plus insignifiante, laisse une trace inaltérable, indéfiniment susceptible de reparaître au jour. A conclusion to which we are urged by so many of the other pathological manifestations of the psychic life. Let us now bear in mind this extraordinary capability of the memory in the dream in order to perceive vividly the contradictions which must be advanced in certain dream theories to be mentioned later, when they endeavour to explain the absurdities and incoherence of dreams through a partial forgetting of what we have known during the day. One might even think of reducing the phenomenon of dreaming to that of memory, and of regarding the dream as the manifestation of an activity of reproduction which does not rest even at night, and which is an end in itself. Views like those expressed by Pilch would corroborate this, according to which intimate relations are demonstrable between the time of dreaming and the contents of the dream from the fact that the impressions reproduced by the dream in sound sleep belong to the remotest past, while those reproduced towards morning are of recent origin. But such a conception is rendered improbable from the outset by the manner of the dream's behaviour towards the material to be remembered. Strumpel justly calls our attention to the fact that repetitions of experiences do not occur in the dream. To be sure, the dream makes an effort in that direction, but the next link is wanting, or appears in changed form, or it is replaced by something entirely novel. The dream shows only fragments of reproduction. This is so often the rule that it admits of theoretical application. Still, there are exceptions in which the dream repeats an episode as thoroughly as our memory would do in its waking state. Delboeuf tells of one of his university colleagues who in his dream repeated, with all its details, a dangerous wagon ride in which he escaped accident as if by miracle. Miss Calkins mentions 2 dreams, the contents of which exactly reproduced incidents from the day before, and I shall later take occasion to report an example which came to my notice showing a childish experience which returned unchanged in a dream. C. Dream stimuli and dream sources. What is meant by dream stimuli and dream sources may be explained by referring to the popular saying, "Dreams come from the stomach." This notion conceals a theory which conceives the dream as a result of a disturbance of sleep. We should not have dreamed if some disturbing element had not arisen in sleep, and the dream is the reaction from this disturbance. The discussion of the exciting causes of dreams takes up the most space in the descriptions of the authors. That this problem could appear only after the dream had become an object of biological investigation is self-evident. The ancients who conceived the dream as a divine inspiration had no need of looking for its exciting source. To them, the dream resulted from the will of the divine or demoniacal powers, and its content was the product of their knowledge or intention. Science, however, soon raised the question whether the stimulus to the dream is always the same, or whether it might be manifold, and thus led to the question whether the causal explanation of the dream belongs to psychology or rather to physiology. Most authors seem to assume that the causes of the disturbance of sleep, and hence the sources of the dream, might be of various natures, and that physical as well as mental irritations might assume the role of dream inciters. Opinions differ greatly in preferring this or that one of the dream sources, in ranking them, and indeed as to their importance for the origin of dreams. Wherever the enumeration of dream sources is complete, we ultimately find 4 forms, which are also utilized for the division of dreams. 1. External, objective sensory stimuli. 2. Internal, subjective sensory stimuli. 3. Internal, organic physical excitations. 4. Purely psychical exciting sources. 1. The external sensory stimuli. The younger Strumpel, son of the philosopher whose writings on the subject have already more than once served us as a guide in the problem of dreams, has, as is well known, reported his observations on a patient who was afflicted with general anesthesia of the skin and with paralysis of several of the higher sensory organs. This man merged into sleep when his few remaining sensory paths from the outer world were shut off. When we wish to sleep, we are wont to strive for a situation resembling the one in Strumpel's experiment. We close the most important sensory paths, the eyes, and we endeavour to keep away from the other senses every stimulus and every change of the stimuli acting upon them. We then fall asleep, although we are never perfectly successful in our preparations. We can neither keep the stimuli away from the sensory organs altogether, nor can we fully extinguish the irritability of the sensory organs. That we may at any time be awakened by stronger stimuli should prove to us that the mind has remained in constant communication with the material world even during sleep. The sensory stimuli which reach us during sleep may easily become the source of dreams. There are a great many stimuli of such nature, ranging from those that are unavoidable, being brought on by the sleeping state, or at least occasionally induced by it, to the accidental waking stimuli, which are adapted or calculated to put an end to sleep. Thus a strong light may force itself into the eye, a noise may become perceptible, or some odoriferous matter may irritate the mucous membrane of the nose. In the spontaneous movements of sleep we may lay bare parts of the body and thus expose them to a sensation of cold, or through change of position we may produce sensations of pressure and touch. A fly may bite us, or a slight accident at night may simultaneously attack more than one sense. Observers have called attention to a whole series of dreams in which the stimulus verified on waking and a part of the dream content corresponded to such a degree that the stimulus could be recognized as the source of the dream. I shall here cite a number of such dreams collected by Jessen, page 527, traceable to more or less accidental objective sensory stimuli. Every indistinctly perceived noise gives rise to corresponding dream pictures. The rolling of thunder takes us into the thick of battle, the crowing of a cock may be transformed into human shrieks of terror, and the creaking of a door may conjure up dreams of burglars breaking into the house. When one of our blankets slips off at night, we may dream that we are walking about naked or falling into the water. If we lie diagonally across the bed with our feet extending beyond the edge, we may dream of standing on the brink of a terrifying precipice, or of falling from a steep height. Should our head accidentally get under the pillow, we may then imagine a big rock hanging over us and about to crush us under its weight. Accumulation of semen produces voluptuous dreams, and local pain the idea of suffering ill treatment, of hostile attacks, or of accidental bodily injuries. Meyer, Versuch einer Erklärung der Nachtwandelns, Halle, 1758, page 33, once dreamed of being assaulted by several persons who threw him flat on the ground and drove a stake into the ground between his big and second toes. While imagining this in his dream, he suddenly awoke and felt a blade of straw sticking between his toes. The same author, according to Hemmings, Von den Traumen auch Nachtwandeln, Weimar, 1784, page 258, dreamed on another occasion that he was being hanged when his shirt was pinned somewhat tight around his neck. Hofbauer dreamed in his youth of having fallen from a high wall and found upon waking that the bedstead had come apart and that he had actually fallen to the floor. Gregory relates that he once applied a hot water bottle to his feet and dreamed of taking a trip to the summit of Mount Etna, where he found the heat on the ground almost unbearable. After having applied a blistering plaster to his head, a second man dreamed of being scalped by Indians. A third, whose shirt was damp, dreamed of being dragged through a stream. An attack of gout caused the patient to believe that he was in the hands of the Inquisition and suffering pains of torture, Macnish. The argument based upon the resemblance between stimulus and dream content is reinforced if, through a systematic induction of stimuli, we succeed in producing dreams corresponding to the stimuli. According to Macnish, such experiments have already been made by Guiron de Bouzarengue. He left his knee exposed and dreamed of travelling in a mail coach at night. He remarked in this connection that travellers could well know how cold the knees become in a coach at night. Another time he left the back of his head uncovered, and dreamed of taking part in a religious ceremony in the open air. In the country where he lived it was customary to keep the head always covered, except on such occasions. Maury reports new observations on dreams produced in himself. A number of other attempts produced no results. 1. He was tickled with a feather on his lips and on the tip of his nose. He dreamed of awful torture, viz. That a mask of pitch was stuck to his face and then forcibly torn off, taking the skin with it. 2. Scissors were sharpened on pincers. He heard bells ringing, then sounds of alarm which took him back to the June days of 1848. 3. Cologne water was put on his nose. He found himself in Cairo in the shop of John Maria Farina. This was followed by mad adventures which he was unable to reproduce. 4. His neck was lightly pinched. He dreamed that a blistering plaster was put on him, and thought of a doctor who treated him in his childhood. 5. A hot iron was brought near his face. He dreamed that chauffeurs, bands of robbers in the Vendée who resorted to this form of torture, broke into his house and forced the occupants to give up their money by sticking their feet into burning coals. The Duchess of Abrantes, whose secretary he imagined himself in the dream, then entered. 6. A drop of water was let fall on his forehead. He imagined himself in Italy, perspiring heavily and drinking white wine of Orvieto. 7. When a burning candle was repeatedly focused on him through red paper, he dreamed of the weather, of heat, and of a storm at sea which he once experienced in the English Channel. Dervy, Weigand, and others have made other attempts to produce dreams experimentally. Many have observed the striking skill of the dream in interweaving into its structure sudden impressions from the outer world in such a manner as to present a gradually prepared and initiated catastrophe. Hildebrandt. In former years, this author relates, I occasionally made use of an alarm clock in order to wake regularly at a certain hour in the morning. It probably happened hundreds of times that the sound of this instrument fitted into an apparently very long and connected dream, as if the entire dream had been especially designed for it, as if it found in this sound its appropriate and logically indispensable point, its inevitable issue. I shall cite 3 of these alarm clock dreams for another purpose. Volkelt, page 68, relates, a composer once dreamed that he was teaching school and was just explaining something to his pupils. He had almost finished when he turned to one of the boys with the question, "Did you understand me?" The boy cried out like one possessed, "Ja!" Annoyed at this, he reprimanded him for shouting, but now the entire class was screaming, "Urja!" then "Urjo!" and finally, "Furjo!" He was now aroused by an actual alarm of fire in the street. Garnier, Traité des facultés de l'âme, 1865, reported by Radestock, relates that Napoleon I, while sleeping in a carriage, was awakened from a dream by an explosion, which brought back to him the crossing of the Tagliamento and the bombarding of the Austrians, so that he started up crying, "We are undermined!" The following dream of Maury has become celebrated. He was sick and remained in bed. His mother sat beside him. He then dreamed of the reign of terror at the time of the Revolution. He took part in terrible scenes of murder, and finally he himself was summoned before the tribunal. There he saw Robespierre, Marat, Fouquier-Tinville, and all the sorry heroes of that cruel epoch. He had to give an account of himself, and after all sorts of incidents which did not fix themselves in his memory, he was sentenced to death. Accompanied by an enormous crowd, he was led to the place of execution. He mounted the scaffold. The executioner tied him to the board, it tipped, and the knife of the guillotine fell. He felt his head severed from the trunk, and awakened in terrible anxiety, only to find that the top piece of the bed had fallen down, and had actually struck his cervical vertebra in the same manner as the knife of a guillotine. This dream gave rise to an interesting discussion introduced by Le Lorrain and Egger in the Revue philosophique. The question was whether and how it was possible for the dreamer to crowd together an amount of dream content, apparently so large, in the short space of time elapsing between the perception of the waking stimulus and the awakening. Examples of this nature make it appear that the objective stimuli during sleep are the most firmly established of all the dream sources. Indeed, it is the only stimulus which plays any part in the layman's knowledge. If we ask an educated person who is, however, unacquainted with the literature of dreams how dreams originate, he is sure to answer by referring to a case familiar to him in which a dream has been explained after waking by a recognized objective stimulus. Scientific investigation cannot, however, stop here, but is incited to further research by the observation that the stimulus influencing the senses during sleep does not appear in the dream at all in its true form, but is replaced by some other presentation which is in some way related to it. But the relation existing between the stimulus and the result of the dream is, according to Maury, une affinité quelconque, mais qui n'est pas unique et exclusive. Page 72. If we read, e.g., 3 of Hildebrandt's alarm clock dreams, we will then have to inquire why the same stimulus evoked so many different results, and why just these results and no others. Page 37. I am taking a walk on a beautiful spring morning. I saunter through the green fields to a neighbouring village, where I see the natives going to church in great numbers, wearing their holiday attire and carrying their hymn books under their arms. I remember that it is Sunday, and that the morning service will soon begin. I decide to attend it, but as I am somewhat overheated, I also decide to cool off in the cemetery surrounding the church. While reading the various epitaphs, I hear the sexton ascend the tower, and see the small village bell in the cupola, which is about to give signal for the beginning of the devotions. For another short while it hangs motionless, then it begins to swing, and suddenly its notes resound so clearly and penetratingly that my sleep comes to an end. But the sound of bells comes from the alarm clock. A second combination. It is a clear day. The streets are covered with deep snow. I have promised to take part in a sleigh ride, but have had to wait for some time before it was announced that the sleigh is in front of my house. The preparations for getting into the sleigh are now made. I put on my furs and adjust my muff, and at last I am in my place. But the departure is still delayed, until the reins give the impatient horses the perceptible sign. They start, and the sleigh bells, now forcibly shaken, begin their familiar Janizary music with a force that instantly tears the gossamer of my dream. Again it is only the shrill sound of my alarm clock. Still a third example. I see the kitchen maid walk along the corridor to the dining room with several dozen plates piled up. The porcelain column in her arms seems to me to be in danger of losing its equilibrium. "Take care," I exclaim, "you will drop the whole pile." The usual retort is naturally not wanting, that she is used to such things. Meanwhile I continue to follow her with my worried glance, and behold, at the doorstep the fragile dishes fall, tumble, and roll across the floor in hundreds of pieces. But I soon notice that the noise continuing endlessly is not really a rattling, but a true ringing, and with this ringing the dreamer now becomes aware that the alarm clock has done its duty. The question why the dreaming mind misjudges the nature of the objective sensory stimulus has been answered by Strumpel, and almost identically by Wundt, to the effect that the reaction of the mind to the attacking stimuli in sleep is determined by the formation of illusions. A sensory impression is recognized by us and correctly interpreted, i.e., it is classed with the memory group to which it belongs according to all previous experience, if the impression is strong, clear, and long enough, and if we have the necessary time at our disposal for this reflection. If these conditions are not fulfilled, we mistake the objects which give rise to the impression, and on its basis we form an illusion. If one takes a walk in an open field and perceives indistinctly a distant object, it may happen that he will at first take it for a horse. On closer inspection, the image of a cow resting may obtrude itself, and the presentation may finally resolve itself with certainty into a group of people sitting. The impressions which the mind receives during sleep through outer stimuli are of a similar indistinct nature. They give rise to illusions because the impression evokes a greater or lesser number of memory pictures through which the impression receives its psychic value. In which of the many spheres of memory to be taken into consideration the corresponding pictures are aroused, and which of the possible association connections thereby come into force, this, even according to Strumpel, remains indeterminable, and is left, as it were, to the caprice of the psychic life. We may here take our choice. We may admit that the laws of the dream formation cannot really be traced any further, and therefore refrain from asking whether or not the interpretation of the illusion evoked by the sensory impression depends upon still other conditions. Or we may suppose that the objective sensory stimulus encroaching upon sleep plays only a modest part as a dream source, and that other factors determine the choice of the memory picture to be evoked. Indeed, on carefully examining Maury's experimentally produced dreams, which I have purposely reported in detail, one is apt to think that the experiment really explains the origin of only one of the dream elements, and that the rest of the dream content appears, in fact, too independent, too much determined in detail to be explained by the one demand, viz., that it must agree with the element experimentally introduced. Indeed, one even begins to doubt the illusion theory, and the power of the objective impression to form the dream, when one learns that this impression at times experiences the most peculiar and far-fetched interpretations during the sleeping state. Thus, B.M. Simon tells of a dream in which he saw persons of gigantic stature seated at a table, and heard distinctly the awful rattling produced by the impact of their jaws while chewing. On waking, he heard the clacking of the hoofs of a horse galloping past his window. If the noise of the horse's hoofs had recalled ideas from the memory sphere of Gulliver's Travels, the sojourn with the giants of Brobdingnag and the virtuous horse creatures, as I should perhaps interpret it without any assistance on the author's part, should not the choice of a memory sphere so uncommon for the stimulus have some further illumination from other motives? 2. Internal, subjective sensory stimuli. Notwithstanding all objections to the contrary, we must admit that the role of the objective sensory stimuli as a producer of dreams has been indisputably established, and if these stimuli seem perhaps insufficient in their nature and frequency to explain all dream pictures, we are then directed to look for other dream sources acting in an analogous manner. I do not know where the idea originated that along with the outer sensory stimuli, the inner, subjective stimuli should also be considered, but as a matter of fact this is done more or less fully in all the more recent descriptions of the etiology of dreams. An important part is played in dream illusions, says Wundt, page 363, by those subjective sensations of seeing and hearing which are familiar to us in the waking state as a luminous chaos in the dark field of vision, ringing, buzzing, etc. of the ears, and especially irritation of the retina. This explains the remarkable tendency of the dream to delude the eyes with numbers of similar or identical objects. Thus we see spread before our eyes numberless birds, butterflies, fishes, coloured beads, flowers, etc. Here the luminous dust in the dark field of vision has taken on fantastic figures, and the many luminous points of which it consists are embodied by the dream in as many single pictures, which are looked upon as moving objects owing to the mobility of the luminous chaos. But this is also the root of the great fondness of the dream for the most complex animal figures, the multiplicity of forms readily following the form of the subjective light pictures. The subjective sensory stimuli as a source of the dream have the obvious advantage that unlike the objective stimuli they are independent of external accidents. They are, so to speak, at the disposal of the explanation as often as it needs them. They are, however, in so far inferior to the objective sensory stimuli that the role of dream inciter, which observation and experiment have proven for the latter, can be verified in their case only with difficulty, or not at all. The main proof for the dream-inciting power of subjective sensory excitement is offered by the so-called hypnagogic hallucinations, which have been described by John Muller as fantastic visual manifestations. They are those very vivid and changeable pictures which occur regularly in many people during the period of falling asleep, and which may remain for a while even after the eyes have been opened. Maury, who was considerably troubled by them, subjected them to a thorough study, and maintained that they are related to, or rather identical with, dream pictures. This has already been asserted by John Muller. Mori states that a certain psychic passivity is necessary for their origin. It requires a relaxation of the tension of attention, page 59. But in any ordinary disposition, a hypnagogic hallucination may be produced by merging for a second into such lethargy, after which one perhaps awakens until this oft-repeated process terminates in sleep. According to Mori, if one awakens shortly thereafter, it is often possible to demonstrate the same pictures in the dream which one has perceived as hypnagogic hallucinations before falling asleep, page 134. Thus it once happened to Mori with a group of pictures of grotesque figures with distorted features and strange headdresses, which obtruded themselves upon him with incredible importunity during the period of falling asleep, and which he recalled having dreamed upon wakening. On another occasion, while suffering from hunger, because he kept himself on a rather strict diet, he saw hypnagogically a plate and a hand armed with a fork taking some food from the plate. In his dream he found himself at a table abundantly supplied with food, and heard the rattle made by the diners with their forks. On still another occasion, after falling asleep with irritated and painful eyes, he had the hypnagogic hallucination of seeing microscopically small characters which he was forced to decipher one by one with great exertion. Having been awakened from his sleep an hour later, he recalled a dream in which there was an open book with very small letters, which he was obliged to read through with laborious effort. Just in the case of these pictures, auditory hallucinations of words, names, etc. may also appear hypnagogically, and then repeat themselves in the dream, like an overture announcing the principal motive of the opera which is to follow. A more recent observer of hypnagogic hallucinations, G. Trumbull Ladd, takes the same path pursued by John Muller and Mori. By dint of practice, he succeeded in acquiring the faculty of suddenly arousing himself, without opening his eyes, 2 to 5 minutes after having gradually fallen asleep, which gave him opportunity to compare the sensations of the retina just vanishing with the dream pictures remaining in his memory. He assures us that an intimate relation between the two can always be recognized, in the sense that the luminous dots and lines of the spontaneous light of the retina produced, so to speak, the sketched outline or scheme for the psychically perceived dream figures. A dream, e.g., in which he saw in front of him clearly printed lines which he read and studied, corresponded to an arrangement of the luminous dots and lines in the retina in parallel lines, or, to express it in his own words, the clearly printed page, which he was reading in the dream, resolved itself into an object which appeared to his waking perception like part of an actual printed sheet looked at through a little hole in a piece of paper from too great a distance to be made out distinctly. Without in any way underestimating the central part of the phenomenon, Ladd believes that hardly any visual dream occurs in our minds that is not based on material furnished by this inner condition of stimulation in the retina. This is particularly true of dreams occurring shortly after falling asleep in a dark room, while dreams occurring in the morning, near the period of awakening, receive their stimulation from the objective light penetrating the eye from the lightened room. The shifting and endlessly variable character of the spontaneous luminous excitation of the retina corresponds exactly to the fitful succession of pictures presented to us in our dreams. If we attach any importance to Ladd's observations, we cannot underrate the productiveness of this subjective source of excitation for the dream, for visual pictures apparently form the principal constituent of our dreams. The share furnished from the spheres of the other senses, beside the sense of hearing, is more insignificant and inconstant. 3. Internal, organic physical excitation. If we are disposed to seek dream sources not outside but inside the organism, we must remember that almost all our internal organs, which in their healthy state hardly remind us of their existence, may, in states of excitation, as we call them, or in disease, become for us a source of the most painful sensations, which must be put on an equality with the external excitants of the pain and sensory stimuli. It is on the strength of very old experience that, e.g., Strumpel declares that during sleep the mind becomes far more deeply and broadly conscious of its connection with the body than in the waking state, and it is compelled to receive and be influenced by stimulating impressions originating in parts and changes of the body of which it is unconscious in the waking state. Even Aristotle declares it quite possible that the dream should draw our attention to incipient morbid conditions which we have not noticed at all in the waking state, owing to the exaggeration given by the dream to the impressions, and some medical authorities, who were certainly far from believing in any prophetic power of the dream, have admitted this significance of the dream at least for the foretelling of disease. Compare M. Sigmund, page 31, and many older authors. Even in our times there seems to be no lack of authenticated examples of such diagnostic performances on the part of the dream. Thus Tissier cites from Artigue, Essai sur la valeur sémiologique des rêves, the history of a woman of 43 years who, during several years of apparently perfect health, was troubled with anxiety dreams, and in whom medical examination later disclosed an incipient affection of the heart to which she soon succumbed. Serious disturbances of the internal organs apparently act as inciters of dreams in a considerable number of persons. Attention is quite generally called to the frequency of anxiety dreams in the diseases of the heart and lungs. Indeed, this relation of the dream life is placed so conspicuously in the foreground by many authors that I shall here content myself with a mere reference to the literature: Radstock, Spitta, Maury, M. Simon, Tissier. Tissier even assumes that the diseased organs impress upon the dream content their characteristic features. The dreams of persons suffering from diseases of the heart are generally very brief and terminate in a terrified awakening. The situation of death under terrible circumstances almost always plays a part in their content. Those suffering from diseases of the lungs dream of suffocation, of being crowded, and of flight, and a great many of them are subject to the well-known nightmare, which, by the way, Boehner has succeeded in producing experimentally by lying on the face and closing up the openings of the respiratory organs. In digestive disturbances, the dream contains ideas from the sphere of enjoyment and disgust. Finally, the influence of sexual excitement on the dream content is perceptible enough in everyone's experience, and lends the strongest support to the entire theory of the dream excitation through organic sensation. Moreover, as we go through the literature of the dream, it becomes quite obvious that some of the authors, Maury, Weigand, have been led to the study of dream problems by the influence of their own pathological state on the content of their dreams. The addition to dream sources from these undoubtedly established facts is, however, not as important as one might be led to suppose, for the dream is a phenomenon which occurs in healthy persons, perhaps in all persons and every night, and a pathological state of the organs is apparently not one of its indispensable conditions. For us, however, the question is not whence particular dreams originate, but what may be the exciting source for the ordinary dreams of normal persons. But we need go only a step further to find a dream source which is more prolific than any of those mentioned above, which indeed promises to be inexhaustible in every case. If it is established that the bodily organs become in sickness an exciting source of dreams, and if we admit that the mind, diverted during sleep from the outer world, can devote more attention to the interior of the body, we may readily assume that the organs need not necessarily become diseased in order to permit stimuli, which in some way or other grow into dream pictures, to reach the sleeping mind. What in the waking state we broadly perceive as general sensation, distinguishable by its quality alone, to which, in the opinion of the physicians, all the organic systems contribute their shares, this general sensation at night attaining powerful efficiency and becoming active with its individual components, would naturally furnish the most powerful as well as the most common source for the production of the dream presentations. It still remains, however, to examine according to what rule the organic sensations become transformed into dream presentations. The theory of the origin of dreams just stated has been the favourite with all medical authorities. The obscurity which conceals the essence of our being, the moisse blanchenique, as Tissier terms it, from our knowledge, and the obscurity of the origin of the dream correspond too well not to be brought into relation with each other. The train of thought which makes organic sensation the inciter of the dream has besides another attraction for the physician, inasmuch as it favours the etiological union of the dream and mental diseases, which show so many agreements in their manifestations, for alterations in the organic sensations and excitations emanating from the inner organs are both of wide significance in the origin of the psychoses. It is therefore not surprising that the theory of bodily sensation can be traced to more than one originator who has propounded it independently. A number of authors have been influenced by the train of ideas developed by the philosopher Schopenhauer in 1851. Our conception of the universe originates through the fact that our intellect recasts the impressions coming to it from without in the moulds of time, space, and causality. The sensations from the interior of the organism, proceeding from the sympathetic nervous system, exert in the daytime an influence on our mood for the most part unconscious. At night, however, when the overwhelming influence of the day's impressions is no longer felt, the impressions pressing upward from the interior are able to gain attention, just as in the night we hear the rippling of the spring that was rendered inaudible by the noise of the day. In what other way, then, could the intellect react upon these stimuli than by performing its characteristic function? It will transform the stimuli into figures, filling space and time, which move at the beginning of causality, and thus the dream originates. Scherner, and after him Volkelt, attempted to penetrate into closer relations between physical sensations and dream pictures, but we shall reserve the discussion of these attempts for the chapter on the theory of the dream. In a study particularly logical in its development, the psychiatrist Krauss found the origin of the dream as well as of deliria and delusions in the same element, viz., the organically determined sensation. According to this author, there is hardly a place in the organism which might not become the starting point of a dream or of a delusion. Now, organically determined sensations may be divided into two classes. 1. Those of the total feeling, general sensations. 2. Specific sensations, which are inherent in the principal systems of the vegetative organism, which may be divided into 5 groups: A. The muscular, B. The pneumatic, C. The gastric, D. The sexual, E. The peripheral sensations. Page 33 of the second article. The origin of the dream picture on the basis of the physical sensations is conceived by Krauss as follows. The awakened sensation evokes a presentation related to it in accordance with some law of association, and combines with this, thus forming an organic structure towards which, however, consciousness does not maintain its normal attitude, for it does not bestow any attention on the sensation itself, but concerns itself entirely with the accompanying presentation. This is likewise the reason why the state of affairs in question should have been so long misunderstood. Page 11, etc. Krauss finds for this process the specific term of transubstantiation of the feeling into dream pictures. Page 24. That the organic bodily sensations exert some influence on the formation of the dream is nowadays almost universally acknowledged, but the question as to the law underlying the relation between the two is answered in various ways and often in obscure terms. On the basis of the theory of bodily excitation, the special task of dream interpretation is to trace back the content of a dream to the causative organic stimulus, and if we do not recognize the rules of interpretation advanced by Scherner, we frequently find ourselves confronted with the awkward fact that the organic exciting source reveals itself in the content of the dream only. A certain agreement, however, is manifested in the interpretation of the various forms of dreams which have been designated as typical because they recur in so many persons with almost the same contents. Among these are the well-known dreams of falling from heights, of the falling out of teeth, of flying, and of embarrassment because of being naked or barely clad. This last dream is said to be caused simply by the perception felt in sleep that one has thrown off the bed cover and is exposed. The dream of the falling out of teeth is explained by dental irritation, which does not, however, of necessity imply a morbid state of excitation in the teeth. According to Strumpel, the flying dream is the adequate picture used by the mind to interpret the sum of excitation emanating from the rising and sinking of the pulmonary lobes after the cutaneous sensation of the thorax has been reduced to insensibility. It is this latter circumstance that causes a sensation related to the conception of flying. Falling from a height in a dream is said to have its cause in the fact that when unconscious of the sensation of cutaneous pressure has set in, either an arm falls away from the body or a flexed knee is suddenly stretched out, causing the feeling of cutaneous pressure to return to the consciousness, and the transition to consciousness embodies itself psychically as a dream of falling. Strumpel, page 118. The weakness of these plausible attempts at explanation evidently lies in the fact that without any further elucidation they allow this or that group of organic sensations to disappear from psychic perception or to obtrude themselves upon it until the constellation favourable for the explanation has been established. I shall, however, later have occasion to recur to typical dreams and their origin. From comparison of a series of similar dreams, M. Simon endeavoured to formulate certain rules for the influence of the organic sensations on the determination of the resulting dream. He says, page 34, if any organic apparatus which during sleep normally participates in the expression of an effect for any reason merges into the state of excitation to which it is usually aroused by that effect, the dream thus produced will contain presentations which fit the effect. Another rule reads as follows, page 35. If an organic apparatus is in a state of activity, excitation, or disturbance during sleep, the dream will bring ideas which are related to the exercise of the organic function which is performed by that apparatus. Morley-Vogt has undertaken to prove experimentally the influence assumed by the theory of bodily sensation for a single territory. He has made experiments in altering the positions of the sleeper's limbs, and has compared the resulting dream with his alterations. As a result, he reports the following theories. 1. The position of a limb in a dream corresponds approximately to that of reality, i.e., we dream of a static condition of the limb which corresponds to the real condition. 2. When one dreams of a moving limb, it always happens that one of the positions occurring in the execution of this movement corresponds to the real position. 3. The position of one's own limb may be attributed in the dream to another person. 4. One may dream further that the movement in question is impeded. 5. The limb in any particular position may appear in the dream as an animal or monster, in which case a certain analogy between the two is established. 6. The position of a limb may incite in the dream ideas which bear some relation or other to this limb. Thus, e.g., if we are employed with the fingers, we dream of numerals. Such results would lead me to conclude that even the theory of bodily sensation cannot fully extinguish the apparent freedom in the determination of the dream picture to be awakened. 4. Psychic exciting sources. In treating the relations of the dream to the waking life and the origin of the dream material, we learn that the earliest as well as the latest investigators agreed that men dream of what they are doing in the daytime and of what they are interested in during the waking state. This interest, continuing from waking life into sleep, besides being a psychic tie joining the dream to life, also furnishes us a dream source not to be underestimated, which, taken with those stimuli which become interesting and active during sleep, suffices to explain the origin of all dream pictures. But we have also heard the opposite of the above assertion, viz., that the dream takes the sleeper away from the interests of the day, and that in most cases we do not dream of things that have occupied our attention during the day until after they have lost for the waking life the stimulus of actuality. Hence, in the analysis of the dream life, we are reminded at every step that it is inadmissible to frame general rules without making provision for qualifications expressed by such terms as frequently, as a rule, in most cases, and without preparing for the validity of the exceptions. If the conscious interest, together with the inner and outer sleep stimuli, sufficed to cover the etiology of the dreams, we ought to be in a position to give a satisfactory account of the origin of all the elements of a dream. The riddle of the dream sources would thus be solved, leaving only the task of separating the part played by the psychic and the somatic dream stimuli in individual dreams. But as a matter of fact, no such complete solution of the dream has ever been accomplished in any case. And what is more, everyone attempting such solution has found that in most cases there have remained a great many components of the dream, the source of which he was unable to explain. The daily interest as a psychic source of dreams is evidently not far-reaching enough to justify the confident assertions to the effect that we all continue our waking affairs in the dream. Other psychic sources of dreams are unknown. Hence, with the exception perhaps of the explanation of dreams given by Scherner, which will be referred to later, all explanations found in the literature show a large gap when we come to the derivation of the material for the presentation pictures, which is most characteristic for the dream. In this dilemma, the majority of authors have developed a tendency to depreciate as much as possible the psychic factor in the excitations of dreams, which is so difficult to approach. To be sure, they distinguish as a main division of dreams the nerve-exciting and the association dreams, and assert that the latter has its source exclusively in reproduction. Wundt, page 365. But they cannot yet dismiss the doubt whether they do not appear without being impelled by the psychical stimulus. Volkelt, page 127. The characteristic quality of the pure association dream is also found wanting. To quote Volkelt, page 118, "In the association dreams proper we can no longer speak of such a firm nucleus. Here the loose grouping penetrates also into the centre of the dream. The ideation, which is already set free from reason and intellect, is here no longer held together by the more important psychical and mental stimuli, but is left to its own aimless, shifting, and complete confusion." Wundt, too, attempts to depreciate the psychic factor in the stimulation of dreams by declaring that the phantasms of the dream certainly are unjustly regarded as pure hallucinations, and that probably most dream presentations are really illusions, inasmuch as they emanate from slight sensory impressions which are never extinguished during sleep. Page 338, etc. Weigand agrees with this view, but generalizes it. He asserts that the first source of all dream presentations is a sensory stimulus to which reproductive associations are then joined. Page 17. Tissier goes still further in repressing the psychic exciting sources. Page 183. Les rêves d'origine absolument psychique n'existent pas. And elsewhere, page 6. Les pensées de nos rêves nous viennent de dehors. These authors who, like the influential philosopher Wundt, adopt a middle course, do not fail to remark that in most dreams there is a cooperation of the somatic stimuli with the psychic instigators of the dream, the latter being either unknown or recognized as day interests. We shall learn later that the riddle of the dream formation can be solved by the disclosure of an unsuspected psychic source of excitement. For the present, we shall not be surprised at the overestimation of those stimuli for the formation of the dream which do not originate from psychic life. It is not merely because they alone can easily be found and even confirmed by experiment, but the somatic conception of the origin of dreams thoroughly corresponds to the mode of thinking in vogue nowadays in psychiatry. Indeed, the mastery of the brain over the organism is particularly emphasized. But everything that might prove an independence of the psychic life from the demonstrable organic changes or a spontaneity in its manifestations is alarming to the psychiatrist nowadays, as if an acknowledgment of the same were bound to bring back the times of natural philosophy and the metaphysical conception of the psychic essence. The distrust of the psychiatrist has placed the psyche under a guardian, so to speak, and now demands that none of its feelings shall divulge any of its own faculties. But this attitude shows slight confidence in the stability of the causal concatenation which extends between the material and the psychic. Even where on investigation the psychic can be recognized as the primary cause of a phenomenon, a more profound penetration will some day succeed in finding a continuation of the path to the organic determination of the psychic. But where the psychic must be taken as the terminus for our present knowledge, it should not be denied on that account. D. Why the dream is forgotten after awakening. That the dream fades away in the morning is proverbial. To be sure, it is capable of recollection, for we know the dream only by recalling it after awakening. But very often we believe that we remember it only incompletely, and that during the night there was more of it. We can observe how the memory of a dream which has been still vivid in the morning vanishes in the course of the day, leaving only a few small fragments. We often know that we have been dreaming, but we do not know what, and we are so well used to the fact that the dream is liable to be forgotten that we do not reject as absurd the possibility that one may have been dreaming even when one knows nothing in the morning of either the contents or the fact of dreaming. On the other hand, it happens that dreams manifest an extraordinary retentiveness in the memory. I have had occasion to analyze with my patients dreams which had occurred to them 25 years or more previously, and I can remember a dream of my own which is separated from the present day by at least 37 years, and yet has lost nothing of its freshness in my memory. All this is very remarkable, and for the present incomprehensible. The forgetting of dreams is treated in the most detailed manner by Strumpel. This forgetting is evidently a complex phenomenon, for Strumpel does not explain it by a single reason, but by a considerable number of reasons. In the first place, all those factors which produce forgetfulness in the waking state are also determinant for the forgetting of dreams. When awake, we are wont soon to forget a large number of sensations and perceptions because they are too feeble, and because they are connected with a slight amount of emotional feeling. This is also the case with many dream pictures. They are forgotten because they are too weak, while stronger pictures in proximity will be remembered. Moreover, the factor of intensity in itself is not the only determinant for the preservation of the dream pictures. Strumpel, as well as other authors, Calkins, admits that dream pictures are often rapidly forgotten, although they are known to have been vivid, whereas among those that are retained in memory there are many that are very shadowy and hazy. Besides, in the waking state one is wont to forget easily what happened only once, and to note more easily things of repeated occurrence. But most dream pictures are single experiences, and this peculiarity equally contributes towards the forgetting of all dreams. Of greater significance is a third motive for forgetting. In order that feelings, presentations, thoughts, and the like should attain a certain degree of memory, it is important that they should not remain isolated, but that they should enter into connections and associations of a suitable kind. If the words of a short verse are taken and mixed together, it will be very difficult to remember them. When well arranged in suitable sequence, one word will help another, and the whole remains as sense easily and firmly in the memory for a long time. Contradictions we usually retain with just as much difficulty and rarity as things confused and disarranged. Now, dreams in most cases lack sense and order. Dream compositions are by their very nature incapable of being remembered, and they are forgotten because they usually crumble together the very next moment. To be sure, these conclusions are not in full accord with the observation of Radstock, page 168, that we retain best just those dreams which are most peculiar. According to Strumpel, there are still other factors effective in the forgetting of dreams, which are derived from the relation of the dream to the waking state. The forgetfulness of the waking consciousness for dreams is evidently only the counterpart of the fact already mentioned, that the dream, almost, never takes over successive memories from the waking state, but only certain details of these memories which it tears away from the habitual psychic connections in which they are recalled while we are awake. The dream composition, therefore, has no place in the company of psychic successions which fill the mind. It lacks all the aids of memory. In this manner, the dream structure rises, as it were, from the soil of our psychic life, and floats in psychic space like a cloud in the sky, which the next breath of air soon dispels. Page 87. This is also aided by the fact that, upon awakening, the attention is immediately seized by the inrushing sensory world, and only very few dream pictures can withstand this power. They fade away before the impressions of the new day, like the glow of the stars before the sunlight. As a last factor favouring the forgetting of dreams, we may mention the fact that most people generally take little interest in their dreams. One who investigates dreams for a time and takes a special interest in them usually dreams more during that time than at any other. That is, he remembers his dreams more easily and more frequently. Two other reasons for the forgetting of dreams added by Bonatelli, given by Bernini, to those of Strumpel, have already been included in the latter, namely, 1, that the change of the general feeling between the sleeping and waking states is unfavourable to the mutual reproductions, and 2, that the different arrangement of the presentation material in the dream makes the dream untranslatable, so to speak, for the waking consciousness. It is the more remarkable, as Strumpel observes, that, in spite of all these reasons for forgetting the dream, so many dreams are retained in memory. The continued efforts of the authors to formulate laws for the remembering of dreams amounts to an admission that here, too, there is something puzzling and unsolved. Certain peculiarities relating to the memory of dreams have been particularly noticed of late, e.g., that a dream which is considered forgotten in the morning may be recalled in the course of the day through a perception which accidentally touches the forgotten content of the dream. Radstock, Tissier. The entire memory of the dream is open to an objection calculated to depreciate its value very markedly in critical eyes. One may doubt whether our memory, which omits so much from the dream, does not falsify what it retained. Such doubts relating to the exactness of the reproduction of the dream are expressed by Strumpel when he says, It therefore easily happens that the active consciousness involuntarily inserts much in recollection of the dream. One imagines one has dreamt all sorts of things which the actual dream did not contain. Jessen, page 547, expresses himself very decidedly. Moreover, we must not lose sight of the fact, hitherto little heeded, that in the investigation and interpretation of orderly and logical dreams, we almost always play with the truth when we recall a dream to memory. Unconsciously and unwittingly we fill up the gaps and supplement the dream pictures. Rarely, and perhaps never, has a connected dream been as connected as it appears to us in memory. Even the most truth-loving person can hardly relate a dream without exaggerating and embellishing it. The tendency of the human mind to conceive everything in connection is so great that it unwittingly supplies the deficiencies of connection if the dream is recalled somewhat disconnectedly. The observations of V. Eggers, though surely independently conceived, sound almost like a translation of Jessen's words. L'observation des rêves à ses difficultés spéciales est le seul moyen d'éviter toute erreur en pareille matière et de confier au papier sans le moindre retard ce que l'on vient d'éprouver et de remarquer. Sinon, l'oubli vient vite ou total ou partiel. L'oubli total est sans gravité, mais l'oubli partiel est perfide. Car, si l'on se met ensuite à raconter ce que l'on n'a pas oublié, on est exposé à compléter par imagination les fragments incohérents et disjoints fournis par la mémoire. On devient artiste à son insu, et le récit périodiquement répété s'impose à la créance de son auteur qui, de bonne foi, le présente comme un fait authentique, dûment établi selon les bonnes méthodes. Similarly, Spita, who seems to think that it is only in our attempt to reproduce the dream that we put in order the loosely associated dream elements, to make connection out of disconnection, that is, to add the process of logical connection which is absent in the dream. As we do not at present possess any other objective control for the reliability of our memory, and as indeed such a control is impossible in examining the dream which is our own experience, and for which our memory is the only source, it is a question what value we may attach to our recollections of dreams. E. The psychological peculiarities of dreams. In the scientific investigation of the dream, we start with the assumption that the dream is an occurrence of our own psychic activity. Nevertheless, the finished dream appears to us as something strange, the authorship of which we are so little forced to recognize that we can just as easily say, "A dream appeared to me," as "I have dreamt." Whence this psychic strangeness of the dream? According to our discussion of the sources of dreams, we may suppose that it does not depend on the material reaching the dream content, because this is, for the most part, common to the dream life and waking life. One may ask whether in the dream it is not changes in the psychic processes which call forth this impression, and may so put to test a psychological characteristic of the dream. No one has more strongly emphasized the essential difference between dream and waking life, and utilized this difference for more far-reaching conclusions than G.T. Fechner in some observations in his Elements of Psychophysic, page 520, part 2. He believes that neither the simple depression of conscious psychic life under the main threshold, nor the distraction of attention from the influences of the outer world suffices to explain the peculiarities of the dream life as compared with the waking life. He rather believes that the scene of dreams is laid elsewhere than in the waking presentation life. If the scene of the psychophysical activity were the same during the sleeping and the waking states, the dream, in my opinion, could only be a continuation of the waking ideation maintaining itself at a lower degree of intensity, and must, moreover, share with the latter its material and form. But the state of affairs is quite different. What Fechner really meant has never been made clear, nor has anybody else, to my knowledge, followed further the road, the clue to which he indicated in this remark. An anatomical interpretation in the sense of physiological brain localizations, or even in reference to histological sections of the cerebral cortex, will surely have to be excluded. The thought may, however, prove ingenious and fruitful if it can be referred to a psychic apparatus which is constructed out of many instances placed one behind another. Other authors have been content to render prominent one or another of the tangible psychological peculiarities of the dream life, and perhaps to take these as a starting point for more far-reaching attempts at explanation. It has been justly remarked that one of the main peculiarities of the dream life appears even in the state of falling asleep, and is to be designated as the phenomenon inducing sleep. According to Schleiermacher, page 351, the characteristic part of the waking state is the fact that the psychic activity occurs in ideas rather than in pictures. But the dream thinks in pictures, and one may observe that with the approach of sleep, the voluntary activities become difficult in the same measure as the involuntary appear, the latter belonging wholly to the class of pictures. The inability for such presentation work as we perceive to be intentionally desired, and the appearance of pictures which is regularly connected with this distraction, these are two qualities which are constant in the dream, and which in its psychological analysis we must recognize as essential characters of the dream life. Concerning the pictures, the hypnagogic hallucinations, we have discovered that even in their content they are identical with the dream pictures. The dream therefore thinks preponderantly, but not exclusively, in visual pictures. It also makes use of auditory pictures, and to a lesser extent of the impressions of the other senses. Much is also simply thought, or imagined, probably represented by remnants of word presentations, just as in the waking state. But still what is characteristic for the dream is only those elements of the content which act like pictures, i.e., which resemble more the perceptions than the memory presentations. Disregarding all the discussions concerning the nature of hallucinations, familiar to every psychiatrist, we can say with all well-versed authors that the dream hallucinates, that is, replaces thought through hallucinations. In this respect, there is no difference between visual and acoustic presentations. It has been noticed that the memory of a succession of sounds with which one falls asleep becomes transformed while sinking into sleep into an hallucination of the same melody, so as to make room again on awakening, which may repeatedly alternate with falling into a slumber, for the softer memory presentations which are differently formed in quality. The transformation of an idea into an hallucination is not the only deviation of the dream from a waking thought which perhaps corresponds to it. From these pictures the dream forms a situation. It presents something in the present. It dramatizes an idea, as Spita, page 145, puts it. But the characteristic of this side of the dream life becomes complete only when it is remembered that while dreaming we do not, as a rule, the exceptions require a special explanation, imagine that we are thinking, but that we are living through an experience, i.e., we accept the hallucination with full belief. The criticism that this has not been experienced, but only thought in a peculiar manner, dreamt, comes to us only on awakening. This character distinguishes the genuine sleeping dream from daydreaming, which is never confused with reality. The characteristics of the dream life thus far considered have been summed up by Burdach, page 476, in the following sentences. As characteristic features of the dream, we may add, a, that the subjective activity of our mind appears as objective, inasmuch as our faculty of perception perceives the products of fantasy as if they were sensory activities. b. Sleep abrogates one's self-command, hence falling asleep necessitates a certain amount of passivity. The slumber pictures are conditioned by the relaxation of one's self-command. It is a question now of attempting to explain the credulity of the mind in reference to the dream hallucinations, which can only appear after the suspension of a certain arbitrary activity. Strumpel asserts that the mind behaves in this respect correctly and in conformity with its mechanism. The dream elements are by no means mere presentations, but true and real experiences of the mind, similar to those that appear in the waking state as a result of the senses, page 34. Whereas in the waking state the mind represents and thinks in word pictures and language, in the dream it represents and thinks in real, tangible pictures, page 35. Besides, the dream manifests a consciousness of space by transferring the sensations and pictures, just as in the waking state, into an outer space, page 36. It must therefore be admitted that the mind in the dream is in the same relation to its pictures and perceptions as in the waking state, page 43. If, however, it is thereby led astray, This is due to the fact that it lacks in sleep the criticism which alone can distinguish between the sensory perceptions emanating from within or from without. It cannot subject its pictures to the tests which alone can prove their objective reality. It furthermore neglects to differentiate between pictures that are arbitrarily interchanged and others where there is no free choice. It errs because it cannot apply to its content the law of causality, page 58. In brief, its alienation from the outer world contains also the reason for its belief in the subjective dream world. Delboeuf reached the same conclusion through a somewhat different line of argument. We give to the dream pictures the credence of reality because in sleep we have no other impressions to compare them with, because we are cut off from the outer world. But it is not, perhaps, because we are unable to make tests in our sleep that we believe in the truth of our hallucinations. The dream may delude us with all these tests. It may make us believe that we may touch the rose that we see in the dream, and still we only dream. According to Delboeuf, there is no valid criterion to show whether something is a dream or a conscious reality except, and that only in practical generality, the fact of awakening. I declare delusional everything that is experienced between the period of falling asleep and awakening, if I notice on awakening that I lie in my bed undressed. Page 84. I have considered the dream pictures real during sleep in consequence of the mental habit which cannot be put to sleep of perceiving an outer world with which I can contrast my ego. As the deviation from the outer world is taken as the stamp for the most striking characteristics of the dream, it will be worthwhile mentioning some ingenious observations of old Burdach which will throw light on the relation of the sleeping mind to the outer world, and at the same time serve to prevent us from overestimating the above deductions. Sleep results only under the condition, says Burdach, that the mind is not excited by sensory stimuli. But it is not the lack of sensory stimuli that conditions sleep, but rather a lack of interest for the same. Some sensory impressions are even necessary insofar as they serve to calm the mind. Thus the miller can fall asleep only when he hears the rattling of his mill, and he who finds it necessary to burn a light at night, as a matter of precaution, cannot fall asleep in the dark. Page 457. The psyche isolates itself during sleep from the outer world and withdraws from the periphery. Nevertheless, the connection is not entirely interrupted. If one did not hear and feel even during sleep, but only after awakening, he would certainly never awake. The continuance of sensation is even more plainly shown by the fact that we are not always awakened by the mere sensory force of the impression, but by the psychic relation of the same. An indifferent word does not arouse the sleeper, but if called by name, he awakens. Hence the psyche differentiates sensations during sleep. It is for this reason that we may be awakened by the lack of a sensory stimulus if it relates to the presentation of an important thing. Thus one awakens when the light is extinguished, and the miller when the mill comes to a standstill. That is, the awakening is due to the cessation of a sensory activity which presupposes that it has been perceived, and that it has not disturbed the mind, being indifferent or rather gratifying. Page 460, etc. If we are willing to disregard these objections, which are not to be taken lightly, we still must admit that the qualities of the dream life thus far considered, which originate by withdrawing from the outer world, cannot fully explain the strangeness of the dream. For otherwise it would be possible to change back the hallucinations of the dream into presentations, and the situations of the dream into thoughts, and thus to perform the task of dream interpretation. Now this is what we do when we reproduce the dream from memory after awakening, and whether we are fully or only partially successful in this back translation, the dream still retains its mysteriousness undiminished. Furthermore, all the authors assume unhesitatingly that still other, more far-reaching alterations take place in the presentation of material of waking life. One of them, Strumpel, expresses himself as follows, page 17. With the cessation of the objectively active outlook and of the normal consciousness, the psyche loses the foundation in which were rooted the feelings, desires, interests, and actions. Those psychic states, feelings, interests, estimates, which cling in the waking state to the memory pictures, also succumb to an obscure pressure, in consequence of which their connection with the pictures becomes severed. The perception pictures of things, persons, localities, events, and actions of the waking state are singly very abundantly reproduced, but none of these brings along its psychic value. The latter is removed from them, and hence they float about in the mind dependent upon their own resources. This deprivation the picture suffers of its psychic value, which again goes back to the derivation from the outer world, is according to Schrumpel mainly responsible for the impression of strangeness with which the dream is confronted in our memory. We have heard that even falling asleep carries with it the abandonment of one of the psychic activities, namely the voluntary conduct of the presentation course. Thus, the supposition, suggested also by other grounds, obtrudes itself that the sleeping state may extend its influence also over the psychic functions. One or the other of these functions is perhaps entirely suspended. Whether the remaining ones continue to work undisturbed, whether they can furnish normal work under the circumstances, is the next question. The idea occurs to us that the peculiarities of the dream may be explained through the inferior psychic activity during the sleeping state, but now comes the impression made by the dream upon our waking judgment, which is contrary to such a conception. The dream is disconnected. It unites without hesitation the worst contradictions. It allows impossibilities. It disregards our authoritative knowledge from the day, and evinces ethical and moral dullness. He who would behave in the waking state as the dream does in its situations would be considered insane. He who in the waking state would speak in such manner, or report such things as occur in the dream content, would impress us as confused and weak-minded. Thus we believe that we are only finding words for the fact when we place but little value on the psychic activity in the dream, and especially when we declare that the higher intellectual activities are suspended, or at least much impaired, in the dream. With unusual unanimity, the exceptions will be dealt with elsewhere, the authors have pronounced their judgments on the dream, such judgments as lead immediately to a definite theory or explanation of the dream life. It is time that I should supplement the resume which I have just given with a collection of the utterances of different authors, philosophers and physicians, on the psychological character of the dream. According to Lemoine, the incoherence of the dream picture is the only essential character of the dream. Maury agrees with him. He says, page 163, Il n'y a pas de rêve absolument raisonnable, et qui ne contienne quelque incohérence, quelque anachronisme, quelque absurdité. According to Hegel, quoted by Spita, the dream lacks all objective and comprehensible connection. Dugas says, Le rêve, c'est l'anarchie psychique, affective et mentale. C'est le jeu des fonctions livrées à elles-mêmes et s'exerçant sans contrôle et sans but. Dans le rêve, l'esprit est un automate spirituel. The relaxation, solution, and confusion of the presentation life which is held together through the logical force of the central ego is conceded even by Volkelt, page 14, according to whose theory the psychic activity during sleep seems in no way aimless. The absurdity of the presentation connections appearing in the dream can hardly be more strongly condemned than it was by Cicero, De Divin, too. Nihil tam prepostere, tam incondite, tam monstruose cogitari potest, quod non possimus somniare. Fechner says, page 522, It is as if the psychological activity were transferred from the brain of a reasonable being into the brain of a fool. Radistock, page 145, says, It seems indeed impossible to recognize in this absurd action any firm law. Having withdrawn itself from the strict police of the rational will guiding the waking presentation life and of the attention, the dream whirls everything about kaleidoscopically in mad play. Hildebrandt, page 45, says, What wonderful jumps the dreamer allows himself, e.g. in his chain of reasoning. With what unconcern he sees the most familiar laws of experience turned upside down. What ridiculous contradictions he can tolerate in the orders of nature and society before things go too far, as we say, and the overstraining of the nonsense brings an awakening. We often multiply quite unconcernedly. 3 times 3 make 20. We are not at all surprised when a dog recites poetry for us, when a dead person walks to his grave, and when a rock swims on the water. We go in all earnestness by high command to the Duchy of Bernburg or the Principality of Liechtenstein in order to observe the navy of the country, or we allow ourselves to be recruited as a volunteer by Charles XII shortly before the Battle of Poltava. Binz, page 33, points to a dream theory resulting from the impressions. Among 10 dreams, 9 at least have an absurd content. We unite in them persons or things which do not bear the slightest relation to one another. In the next moment, as in a kaleidoscope, the grouping changes, if possible, to one more nonsensical and irrational than before. Thus the changing play of the imperfectly sleeping brain continues until we awaken, and put our hand to our forehead, and ask ourselves whether we really still possess the faculty of rational imagination and thought. Maury, page 50, finds for the relation of the dream picture to the waking thoughts a comparison most impressive for the physician. La production de ces images, que chez l'homme éveillé fait le plus souvent naître la volonté, correspond, pour l'intelligence, à ce que pour la motilité certains mouvements que nous offrent la chorée et les affections paralytiques. For the rest, he considers the dream toute une série de dégradations de la faculté pensant et raisonnant. Page 27. It is hardly necessary to mention the utterances of the authors which repeat Maury's assertion for the individual higher psychic activities. According to Strumpel, some logical mental operations based on relations and connections disappear in the dream, naturally also at points where the nonsense is not obvious, page 26. According to Spitter, page 148, the presentations in the dream are entirely withdrawn from the laws of causality. Radstock and others emphasize the weakness of judgment and decision in the dream. According to Jodl, page 123, there is no critique in the dream and no correcting of a series of perceptions through the content of the sum of consciousness. The same author states that all forms of conscious activity occur in the dream, but they are imperfect, inhibited, and isolated from one another. The contradictions manifested in the dream towards our conscious knowledge are explained by Stricker, and many others, on the ground that facts are forgotten in the dream, and logical relations between presentations are lost, page 98, etc., etc. The authors who in general speak thus unfavourably about the psychic capacities in the dream nevertheless admit that the dream retains a certain remnant of psychic activity. Wundt, whose teaching has influenced so many other workers in the dream problems, positively admits this. One might inquire as to the kind and behaviour of the remnants of the psychic life which manifest themselves in the dream. It is now quite universally acknowledged that the reproductive capacity, the memory in the dream, seems to have been least affected. Indeed, it may show a certain superiority over the same function in the waking life, vid supra, page 10. Although a part of the absurdities of the dream are to be explained by just this forgetfulness of the dream life. According to Spitter, it is the emotional life of the psyche that is not overtaken by sleep, and that then directs the dream. By emotion, Gemut, we understand the constant comprehension of the feelings as the inmost subjective essence of man, page 84. Scholz, page 37, sees a psychic activity manifested in the dream in the allegorizing interpretation to which the dream material is subjected. Siebeck verifies also in the dream the supplementary interpretative activity, page 11, which the mind exerts on all that is perceived and viewed. The judgment of the apparently highest psychic function, the consciousness, presents for the dream a special difficulty. As we can know anything only through consciousness, there can be no doubt as to its retention. Spitter, however, believes that only consciousness is retained in the dream, and not self-consciousness. Delboeuf confesses that he is unable to conceive this differentiation. The laws of association which govern the connection of ideas hold true also for the dream pictures. Indeed, their domination evinces itself in a purer and stronger expression in the dream than elsewhere. Strumpel, page 70, says, "The dream follows either the laws of undisguised presentations, as it seems exclusively, or organic stimuli, along with such presentations, that is, without being influenced by reflection and reason, aesthetic sense and moral judgment." The authors whose views I reproduce here conceive the formation of the dream in about the following manner. The sum of sensation stimuli affecting sleep from the various sources, discussed elsewhere, at first awaken in the mind a sum of presentations which represent themselves as hallucinations. According to Wundt, it is more correct to say as illusions, because of their origin from outer and inner stimuli. These unite with one another according to the known rules of association, and following the same rules, in turn evoke a new series of presentations, pictures. This entire material is then elaborated as well as possible by the still active remnant of the organizing and thinking mental faculties, cf. Wundt and Weigand. But thus far no one has been successful in finding the motive which would decide that the awakening of pictures which do not originate objectively follow this or that law of association. But it has been repeatedly observed that the associations which connect the dream presentations with one another are of a particular kind, and different from those found in the waking mental activity. Thus Volkelt says, "In the dream, the ideas chase and hunt each other on the strength of accidental similarities and barely perceptible connections. All dreams are pervaded by such loose and free associations." Maury attaches great value to this characteristic of connection between presentations, which allows him to bring the dream life in closer analogy to certain mental disturbances. He recognizes two main characters of the délire. 1. Une action spontanée et comme automatique de l'esprit. 2. Une association vicieuse et irrégulière des idées. Page 126. Maury gives us two excellent examples from his own dreams, in which the mere similarity of sound forms the connection of the dream presentations. He dreamed once that he undertook a pilgrimage, pèlerinage, to Jerusalem or Mecca. After many adventures he was with the chemist Pelletier. The latter, after some talk, gave him a zinc shovel, a pelle, which became his long battle sword in the dream fragment which followed, page 137. On another occasion he walked in a dream on the highway, and read the kilometres on the milestones. Presently he was with a spice merchant who had large scales with which to weigh Maury. The spice merchant then said to him, "You are not in Paris, but on the island Gilolo." This was followed by many pictures, in which he saw the flower Lobelia, then the General Lopez, of whose demise he had read shortly before. He finally awoke while playing a game of lotto. We are, however, quite prepared to hear that this depreciation of the psychic activities of the dream has not remained without contradiction from the other side. To be sure, contradiction seems difficult here, nor is it of much significance that one of the depreciators of dream life, Spita, page 118, assures us that the same psychological laws which govern the waking state rule the dream also, or that another, Dugas, states, "Le rêve n'est pas déraison, ni même irraison pure," as long as neither of them has made any effort to bring this estimation into harmony with the psychic anarchy and dissolution of all functions in the dream described by them. Upon others, however, the possibility seems to have dawned that the madness of the dream is perhaps not without its method, that it is perhaps only a sham, like that of the Danish prince, to whose madness the intelligent judgment here cited refers. These authors must have refrained from judging by appearances, or the appearance which the dream showed to them was quite different. Without wishing to linger at its apparent absurdity, Havelock Ellis considers the dream as an archaic world of vast emotions and imperfect thoughts, the study of which may make us acquainted with primitive stages of development of the psychic life. A thinker like Delboeuf asserts, to be sure without adducing proof against the contradictory material, and hence indeed unjustly, "Dans le sommeil, hormis la perception, toutes les facultés de l'esprit, intelligence, imagination, mémoire, volonté, moralité, restent intactes dans leur essence. Seulement, elles s'appliquent à des objets imaginaires et mobiles. Le songeur est un acteur qui joue à volonté les fous et les sages, les bourreaux et les victimes, les nains et les géants, les démons et les anges." Page 222. The Marquis of Hervey, who is sharply controverted by Maury, and whose work I could not obtain despite all effort, seems to combat most energetically the underestimation of the psychic capacity in the dream. Maury speaks of him as follows, page 19. "Monsieur de Marquis d'Hervey prête à l'intelligence durant le sommeil toute sa liberté d'action et d'attention, et il ne semble faire consister le sommeil que dans l'occlusion de sens, dans la fermeture au monde extérieur, en sorte que l'homme qui dort ne se distingue guère, selon sa manière de voir, de l'homme qui laisse vaguer sa pensée en se bouchant les sens. Toute la différence qui sépare alors la pensée ordinaire de celle du dormeur, c'est que, chez celui-ci,
l'idée prend une forme visible, objective et ressemble, à s'y méprendre, à la sensation déterminée par les objets extérieurs. Le souvenir révèle l'apparence du fait présent. Maury adds, however, qu'il y a une différence de plus et capitale, à savoir que les facultés intellectuelles de l'homme endormi n'offrent pas l'équilibre qu'elles gardent chez l'homme l'éveillé.
The scale of the estimation of the dream as a psychic product has a great range in the literature. It reaches from the lowest underestimation, the expression of which we have come to know, through the idea of a value not yet revealed, to the overestimation which places the dream far above the capacities of the waking life. Hildebrandt, who, as we know, sketches the psychological characteristics into three antinomies, sums up in the third of these contradistinctions the extreme points of this series as follows, page 19. It is between a climax, often an involution which raises itself to virtuosity, and on the other hand a decided diminution and weakening of the psychic life, often leading below the human niveau. As for the first, who could not confirm from his own experience that, in the creations and weavings of the genius of the dream, there sometimes comes to light a profundity and sincerity of emotion, a tenderness of feeling, a clearness of view, a fineness of observation, and a readiness of wit, all which we should modestly have to deny that we possess as a constant property during the waking life. The dream has a wonderful poetry, an excellent allegory, an incomparable humour, and a charming irony. It views the world under the guise of a peculiar idealization, and often raises the effect of its manifestations into the most ingenious understanding of the essence lying at its basis. It represents for us earthly beauty in true heavenly radiance, the sublime in the highest majesty, the actually frightful in the most gruesome figure, and the ridiculous in the indescribably drastic comical. And at times we are so full of one of these impressions after awakening that we imagine that such a thing has never been offered to us by the real world. One may ask, is it really the same object that the depreciating remarks and these inspired praises are meant for? Have the latter overlooked the stupid dreams and the former the thoughtful and ingenious dreams? And if both kinds do occur, that is, dreams that merit to be judged in this or that manner, does it not seem idle to seek the psychological character of the dream? Would it not suffice to state that everything is possible in the dream, from the lowest depreciation of the psychic life to a raising of the same which is unusual in the waking state? As convenient as this solution would be, it has this against it, that behind the efforts of all dream investigators it seems to be presupposed that there is such a definable character of the dream which is universally valid in its essential features, and which must eliminate these contradictions. It is unquestionable that the psychic capacities of the dream have found quicker and warmer recognition in that intellectual period which now lies behind us, when philosophy rather than exact natural science ruled intelligent minds. Utterances like those of Schubert, that the dream frees the mind from the power of outer nature, that it liberates the soul from the chains of the sensual, and similar opinions expressed by the younger Fichte, and others who represent the dream as a soaring up of the psychic life to a higher stage, hardly seem conceivable to us today. They are only repeated at present by mystics and devotees. With the advance of the scientific mode of thinking, a reaction took place in the estimation of the dream. It is really the medical authors who are most prone to underrate the psychic activity in the dream as being insignificant and invaluable, whereas philosophers and unprofessional observers, amateur psychologists, whose contributions in this realm can surely not be overlooked, in better agreement with the popular ideas, have mostly adhered to the psychic value of the dream. He who is inclined to underrate the psychic capacity in the dream prefers, as a matter of course, the somatic exciting sources in the etiology of the dream. He who leaves to the dreaming mind the greater part of its capacities naturally has no reason for not also admitting independent stimuli for dreaming. Among the superior activities which, even on sober comparison, one is tempted to ascribe to the dream life, memory is the most striking. We have fully discussed the frequent experiences which prove this fact. Another superiority of the dream life, frequently extolled by the old authors, viz., that it can regard itself supreme in reference to distance of time and space, can be readily recognized as an illusion. This superiority, as observed by Hildebrand, is only illusional. The dream takes as much heed of time and space as the waking thought, and this because it is only a form of thinking. The dream is supposed to enjoy still another advantage in reference to time, that is, it is independent in still another sense of the passage of time. Dreams like the guillotine dream of Maury, reported above, seem to show that the dream can crowd together more perception content in a very short space of time than can be controlled by our psychic activity in the waking mind. These conclusions have been controverted, however, by many arguments. The essays of Le Lorrain and Egger concerning the apparent duration of dreams gave rise to a long and interesting discussion which has probably not said the last word upon this delicate and far-reaching question. That the dream has the ability to take up the intellectual work of the day and bring to a conclusion what has not been settled during the day, that it can solve doubt and problems, and that it may become the source of new inspiration in poets and composers, seems to be indisputable, as is shown by many reports and by the collection compiled by Chabonet. But even if there be no dispute as to the facts, nevertheless their interpretation is open in principle to a great many doubts. Finally, the asserted divinatory power of the dream forms an object of contention in which hard, unsurmountable reflection encounters obstinate and continued faith. It is indeed just that we should refrain from denying all that is based on fact in this subject, as there is a possibility that a number of such cases may perhaps be explained on a natural psychological basis. F. The ethical feelings in the dream. For reasons which will be understood only after cognizance has been taken of my own investigations of the dream, I have separated from the psychology of the dream the partial problem whether and to what extent the moral dispositions and feelings of the waking life extend into the dreams. The same contradictions which we were surprised to observe in the author's descriptions of all the other psychic capacities strike us again here. Some affirm decidedly that the dream knows nothing of moral obligations, others as decidedly that the moral nature of man remains even in his dream life. A reference to our dream experience of every night seems to raise the correctness of the first assertion beyond doubt. Jessen says, page 553, "Nor does one become better or more virtuous in the dream. On the contrary, it seems that conscience is silent in the dream, inasmuch as one feels no compassion and can commit the worst crimes, such as theft, murder, and assassination, with perfect indifference and without subsequent remorse." Radstock, page 146, says, "It is to be noticed that in the dream the associations terminate and the ideas unite without being influenced by reflection and reason, aesthetic taste and moral judgment. The judgment is extremely weak, and ethical indifference reigns supreme." Volkelt, page 23, expresses himself as follows, "As everyone knows, the sexual relationship in the dream is especially unbridled. Just as the dreamer himself is shameless in the extreme, and wholly lacking moral feeling and judgment, so also he sees others, even the most honoured persons, engaged in actions which even in thought he would blush to associate with them in his waking state." Utterances like those of Schopenhauer, that in the dream every person acts and talks in accordance with his character, form the sharpest contrast to those mentioned above. R.P. Fisher maintains that the subjective feelings and desires or affects and passions manifest themselves in the willfulness of the dream life, and that the moral characteristics of a person are mirrored in his dream. Hafner, page 25, "With rare exceptions, a virtuous person will be virtuous also in his dreams. He will resist temptation and show no sympathy for hatred, envy, anger, and all other vices, while the sinful person will, as a rule, also find in his dreams the pictures which he has before him while awake." Scholz, page 36, "In the dream there is truth. Despite all masking in pride or humility, we still recognize our own self. The honest man does not commit any dishonorable offense, even in the dream, or if this does occur, he is terrified over it, as if over something foreign to his nature. The Roman emperor, who ordered one of his subjects to be executed because he dreamed that he cut off the emperor's head, was not wrong in justifying his action on the ground that he who has such dreams must have similar thoughts while awake. About a thing that can have no place in our mind, we therefore say significantly, 'I would never dream of such a thing.' Plath, varying a familiar proverb, says,
Tell me for a time your dreams, and I will tell you what you are within.
The short work of Hildebrand, from which I have already taken so many quotations, a contribution to the dream problem as complete and as rich in thought as I found in the literature, places the problem of morality in the dream as the central point of its interest. For Hildebrand, too, it is a strict rule that the purer the life, the purer the dream, the impurer the former, the impurer the latter. The moral nature of man remains even in the dream. But while we are not offended nor made suspicious by an arithmetical error no matter how obvious, by a reversal of science no matter how romantic, or by an anachronism no matter how witty, we nevertheless do not lose sight of the difference between good and evil, right and wrong, virtue and vice. No matter how much of what follows us during the day may vanish in our hours of sleep, Kant's categorical imperative sticks to our heels as an inseparable companion from whom we cannot rid ourselves even in slumber. This can be explained, however, only by the fact that the fundamental in human nature, the moral essence, is too firmly fixed to take part in the activity of the kaleidoscopic shaking up to which fantasy, reason, memory, and other faculties of the same rank succumb in the dream. Page 45, etc. In the further discussion of the subject we find remarkable distortion and inconsequence in both groups of authors. Strictly speaking,